What I want to do in this video is go through one more story for the Flixster assignment, which is views should be responsive for both landscape and portrait mode. In portrait mode, the poster image, title, and movie overview should be shown, and in landscape mode, we should use an alternative image called the backdrop image, and that should be shown along with the title and movie overview. So this is demonstrated pretty well up here with these screenshots. So you can see in portrait mode, we want to use a taller image because the phone is taller. And in landscape mode, because the phone is rotated and it's wider than it is taller, we want to use an image which is similarly wider than it is taller. And in both cases, we want to have the title and overview on the right side. The way we'll achieve this is through a powerful Android system for alternative resource files that you can read about in this guide here. So the idea is that the Android system will automatically select an alternative resource directory based on the device or user configuration. For example, you can do this with language, screen size, orientation, density, and so on. What we care about is screen orientation, though depending on whether the phone is in portrait or landscape mode, we'll pick an alternate resource file. But this is actually very common. Almost any app will have alternative string resources. And so if the user setting is in French, Spanish, or something else, the strings should be translated. And so the way that works is usually you'll have the strings file with the suffix of the language. And that's how most apps will do internationalization. So what we have here is where we left off the assignment from the previous video. And as a reminder, what you're seeing is the recycler view where each view shown is the default portrait mode layout. And so we can actually try out, if we rotate the phone right now, you can see that we're continuing to use the poster image, which is the taller image instead of the wider image, and all the remaining space is filled up with the title and overview. So there are actually two changes that we would like to make. So one is that we'd like to use a different layout when we go from portrait to landscape mode so that we can allocate more room for the image. And second, we want to actually change the image that we're downloading from the API. Instead of the image URL pointing to an image which is taller, we want to get the backdrop image path, which is the wider image. Let's start by making the change to our layout according to the device configuration. The way we'll do this is with the system that we just talked about, which is using alternative resources based on a qualifier on the resource directory name. As a reminder, this file, itemmovie.xml, is what represents each row in our recycler view. So each movie row is being represented by item movie. And so our goal is to have a different layout file for item movie in landscape mode. The way we'll do this is by right-clicking on the resources directory and going into new Android resource directory. Make sure that you select a resource type of layout because that's what item movie is, a layout file. And select orientation. That's the one that we care about. We want an alternative layout for landscape mode. And so you'll see that the directory name is actually automatically filled in to be layout-land. That's the convention. And just tap OK. So there is actually a brand new resource directory created called layout-land. Annoyingly, Android Studio didn't show it for me. But one thing you can do to see that is go into a different view. So instead of Android, go into the project view, for example, and then just tap on this target icon to open up item movie in the project perspective. And now you should be able to see layout-land. So what we can do here is we're going to copy and paste item movie.xml and put it into layout-land. And we can leave it with the same name. So let's run the project one more time. Let's run the app. And we don't expect to see any change because we simply copied and pasted the view into layout and layout-land. So even if we go into landscape mode, it should really be the same identical layout. However, behind the scenes, there is something different happening because now the Android system is actually using this XML file to render the view when the phone's in landscape mode. And so to prove that, one thing we can do is just change the width to something very different. Let's make it like 10 dp, so something much, much smaller. You can see how how small the view has become. So if we rebuild the app, let's see first in portrait mode, the default, there's no change. But if we go into landscape mode, you can see how tiny the image view has become. So that's proof that this qualifier system, layout dash land, or whatever the qualifier is that you want to add, it is actually working. So the actual change we want to make is simply to make the image wider. So we can do that pretty easily. So let's go into the image view, and instead of it being 10 dp, let's make it something a lot wider, something like 350. So you can see that it took up much more of the screen real estate, and you still have the title and overview on the right side. So let's run that, and we should see the image view be much wider. So you can see that, and of course it doesn't look that good now because we're still using a taller image rather than a wider image. So the next step is we need to use, from the API, instead of getting the poster path, we want to get the backdrop path and replace that when we detect that the phone is in landscape mode. But still, this is pretty cool that without touching a single line of Java code, we are able to utilize the Android system for alternative resources and get a pretty different behavior just by modifying some XML. Okay, in order to figure out how to get the wider image rather than the taller image, open up the sample request, which I have open over here. And the key is that so far we've been parsing out the poster path. The backdrop path is the wider image. And so what we need to do is add some code to parse out the backdrop path and then start referencing that when the phone is in landscape mode. So the place that we do the parsing is in the movie.java. So we take in a JSON object and then we construct a movie object. So we need to add one more field here called backdrop path. And you can parse it out right here. Let's make sure that we have the key correct. Great. And similarly to poster path, we need to have a getter method for this. So let's say public string get backdrop path. So again, like we mentioned in the previous video, in order to be fully correct, what we really should be doing is going into the configurations API, getting a response from there, and that's how we can figure out what are the valid sizes. But for our purposes, we're again just going to hard code the value. So I'm going to copy this, and instead of having the poster path, we're now replacing the end of the URL with the backdrop path. So now we have to use this method, get backdrop path. The place that we render the remote image is happening in the adapter, and in particular when we bind the movie to a view holder. So right here. So instead of always loading in the poster path, there are some cases when we want to load the backdrop path. So what we'll do is let's define the image URL. And that's what we'll load in, the image URL. But the image URL will change depending on if the phone is in landscape or in portrait mode. So something like if phone is in landscape, then we want to set image URL to be the landscape, the backdrop image, and then else we want to just go back to the default, which was the poster image. So that's kind of the pseudocode. And in actual code, the only tricky part is really how do you figure out the orientation of the phone? And the way we do that is by using the context, get resources, get configuration, and then there's a field called orientation. And so we want to check whether this orientation is orientation landscape, like that. So then we can say image URL is the backdrop image, movie dot get backdrop path, and then if it's not in landscape, then we assume that it's in in portrait mode. And so then we can say image URL is equal to movie.getPosterPath. So that should be it. Let's try it out. Let's run the app. And we expect no change to happen in portrait mode. Great, so that looks good. And then in landscape mode, you can see that now we are fetching the wider image, the backdrop image, rather than the taller image. So it definitely looks a lot better.